Hey everybody, Yankee here. Today I want to touch on a hot topic in the courts right now regarding gun rights. And it's whether 18 to 20-year-olds should be able to buy handguns from FFLs, should have all the rights any other adult person would have as far as purchasing a firearm. And recently there's been a lot of court decisions that said, yes, they should. If they're adults, they should have all their rights. And I do agree that either someone is an adult or they aren't. And if they are, they get all their rights. If they're not, they don't. And if they're not an adult, they don't get to vote or anything else either. But recently, there's been a decision that says the Constitution does not give 18 to 20-year-olds a right to buy guns. In fact, originally it didn't give them any rights. And this is why. A judge quoted this. He said that back in the days of the founders, you were not the age of majority until you were 21. Meaning you weren't an adult with all your rights until you were 21. That means you couldn't do anything that an adult could do, really. You didn't have rights to petition the court. You didn't have rights to buy guns. You didn't have a right to do anything if your parents said no until you were 21 years old. Now that's changed in modern times. We've passed laws that say you can vote at 18 and all these other things. Now, back in the day, they did allow young people to go to war. That's something that seems like all governments are good at, is letting minors fight and die for their interests of the country, or the businesses that run the country usually nowadays. But they did not give them full constitutional rights. They did not have, like I said, rights to petition the court or to buy guns or anything. And they are using that now to say that 18, 20-year-olds shouldn't be able to buy firearms. And you know what? That does actually make sense. Makes perfect sense. If you don't say that 18-year-olds are adults. Because the way the law is written, the founders, the way they wrote the Constitution, they didn't say you can't buy a gun until you're 21. They wrote everything with the idea that people under the age of 21 weren't adults. They were still legally considered infants. The English law that came over with the founders and stayed in place throughout the founding of the Constitution, etc., stated that if you were under the age of 21, you were still under the control of your father, and you were legally an infant. You couldn't enter into contracts, you couldn't buy on credit, you couldn't do any of the things like that. So therefore, by default, you didn't have a right to buy guns at 18. Because the law of the land was that 18-year-olds were not adults. Now, does that mean the government prevented them from owning guns or using guns? No. If their father said they could have a gun, they could buy a gun. If their dad gave them money and said, go buy yourself a gun, they could go down and buy a gun. They could definitely use guns in military service or in the militia. And if they didn't have one, the state would give them one. Because a lot of kids apparently didn't have guns at that time, because any money they earned, like if they had a job, which most people had jobs before the age of 21, well, that legally belonged to their father. So unless their father was the type to go, yeah, here, take some money, go buy a gun, well, then a kid just made do without one or use their father's. They didn't go without using guns. They still hunted. They still, like I said, performed military service, etc. So it wasn't that they were prevented from owning guns. They just weren't adults, so they didn't have the right to go buy a gun. They weren't prevented from owning them or weren't prevented from anything like that. So when you take that to modern day and you say 18 to 20-year-olds don't have rights because back in the day they weren't considered adults, well, that's one thing to say, and you can make that argument. But if everywhere else in society you're saying 18-year-olds are adults, well, then you're changing the parameters. Because if you went back in the day and said, well, yeah, the founders were wrong about that, 18-year-olds were adults. Well, then you're saying now that they should have had constitutional rights. They should have had a right to buy a gun. When you say back then they were wrong that black people didn't have rights, they were absolutely wrong, and black people should have had the right to buy a gun. They didn't then because law at the time said they weren't people. Now laws say they're people because they are. They're same as you and me, just a little different in color. So that was erroneous. The standards of the time were erroneous. They should not have been denied their rights simply because they were black or native or a woman, etc. All kinds of things like that. That society has now decided that these people get full rights. And if society has similarly decided that at 18 you are an adult, well then you should have your full constitutional rights. That whole notion that simply because back then under 21-year-olds weren't considered, adults, they didn't have rights, that means you don't have them now. That's an erroneous way to think, because that's also like saying, well, back then blacks didn't have rights, women didn't have rights, Native Americans didn't have rights, so therefore there's a historic precedent for saying they don't have rights now. No, that was just a condition of the time, just like the age requirement was. And we've corrected a lot of those things these days. They gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. 18-year-olds are not beholden to their parents anymore. If my 18-year-old son, I don't have one anymore, they're in their 20s now, but if I'd had an 18-year-old son, or when my sons were 18, if they went out and got a job and they don't want to give me the money, they're not legally required to. And if I try to force an opinion upon them or an idea upon them or make them do something they don't want to do, they don't have to do it. And if I say, well, I'm taking all your property, if it's their property, they can go to court, petition the court, get their property back because they have rights. So in modern society, they have, by pretty much every standard, said the founders were wrong. 18 to 20-year-olds are adults. So therefore, they should have their constitutional rights. Now, I am okay with someone making the argument that 18 to 20-year-olds aren't adults. And I would agree with them. The founders agreed. The founders said that people under the age of 21 did not possess the mental faculties to be reliable, to be dependable. They just weren't adults yet. They did not think that 12-year-olds were adults. Now, when it comes to other things, yes, because, a lot of higher up officials don't want to get in trouble for, raping a 14-year-old. So they said, 12 years old, that's plenty old enough to breed, the things like that. They were very hypocritical about a lot of ideas back then. I'm not defending how they thought back then. I'm just saying that's just the way it was. So this whole notion that you can deny someone constitutional rights today because they were denied those constitutional rights back then because of the condition of the community, conditions of community, the circumstances of community, that doesn't make sense, because then you could do that with a whole bunch of people. If society is going to say you're an 18-year-old adult, well, then you're an adult. Now, if they want to say, yeah, okay, what the error was is in giving 18-year-olds the right to vote, or saying that 18 to 20-year-olds are free from their parents or have their own rights to make their own way or can petition the courts. Now, if they wanted to go back and take all those things back and say we were wrong, 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds are not adults, well, then their argument that they shouldn't have the right to buy guns, that would hold water. And it would make sense, because back then they didn't have that right either. But since they've granted them every other right, because they're saying we're correcting the fact that the founders were wrong on what constitutes an adult, that means that if that had been changed back in the day, blacks would have been able to buy guns. 18-year-olds would have been able to buy guns. Women, everybody would have been able to do that. So either you have to accept that they're not adults today, like I've said multiple times, and say they can't go to war. I think war should be added to that. That's something I think we've always been wrong on. You can't go to war. You can't vote. You can't enter contracts, all that stuff. You can't do that till you're 21. If you do that, then I'll give you the you can't buy guns at 18 or 20. But if you want to say, well, everything was wrong up until we decided 18-year-olds were adults, well, then you have to do that with everything. You don't get to pick and choose, because when you pick and choose, that makes you a hypocrite. I don't like hypocrites. So even though I agree with the founders, 18-year-olds are not adults, they're not mature enough, I would go even one further and say at 25, you become an adult. I've said many times that I'm okay with rounding up people when they turn 13. We take them and put them in special, not camps, but education facilities. Let's call them schools. Maybe on islands somewhere. And then when they're 25, they get to come back to society and be a use to people. I'm fine with that, because I got no use for people under the age of 25. Really nowadays under the age of 35. But I'm not going to be inflexible. But as I've said, that whole idea that because in the day of the founders, you weren't an adult till you were 21, and that gives society the right to deny them rights today because they're not adults, doesn't work if you give them every other right and you hold them to every other standard. If you commit a crime at 17 or 18 and you can be tried as an adult, well, then you get the rights of an adult. If the state can punish you as you're an adult, well, then they have to accept that you're an adult. So I've beaten this into the ground now, but I think you know what I'm saying. I think that conservative judge who said that, yeah, you can deny 18, 20-year-olds their rights because the founders didn't consider them adults, is totally wrong, is creating a really bad precedent right there, because how many other things could you say that with? And like I said, I think it's incredibly hypocritical because we live in a society that has said 18-year-olds are adults. Whether that's right or whether it's wrong, it's pretty much the law of the land.